The scripture lesson for this morning is printed on the bulletin, and the reason I did that is because I'm using the Message translation for this particular scripture passage. It's from the Gospel of Mark. From there, Jesus went to the area of Judea across the Jordan. A crowd of people, as was so often the case, went along, and he, as he so often did, taught them. Pharisees came up intending to give him a hard time. They asked, "Is it legal for a man to divorce his wife?" Jesus said, "What did Moses command?" And they answered, "Moses gave permission to fill out a certificate of dismissal and divorce her." And Jesus said, "Moses wrote this command only as a concession to your hard-hearted ways. In the original creation, God made male and female to be together. Because of this, a man leaves father and mother, and in marriage he becomes one flesh with a woman. No longer two individuals, but forming a new unity, because God created this organic union of the two sexes. No one should desecrate his art by cutting them apart." And when they were back home, the disciples brought it up again. Jesus gave it to them straight. "A man who divorces his wife so he can marry someone else commits adultery against her. And a woman who divorces her husband so she can marry someone else commits adultery." The people brought children to Jesus, hoping he might touch them. The disciples shooed them off, but Jesus was irate and let them know it. "Don't push these children away. Don't ever get between them and me. These children are at the very center of life in the kingdom. Mark this, unless you accept God's kingdom in the simplicity of a child, you'll never enter in." Then gathering the children up in his arms, he laid his hands of blessing on them. Here ends the gospel. You may remain seated now as we sing together, "Let Us Break Bread Together." I'm going to read a piece to you written by William Barnwell, who's an Episcopal priest and wrote a commentary on the book of Mark, and he tells his personal story. "Once I was called on to give a prayer at the wedding reception of a young Jewish woman and a lapsed Episcopalian. The rabbi had just performed witness to marriage, and both families were trying hard to be as nice as they could as they watched their children cross over into unknown lands. But underneath the smiles, there was a look of horror about them. 'My son is marrying a Jew. Our daughter, oh, how could she do this to us? It has never happened to our family before. What did we do to deserve this?' Still, there were smiles and polite chatter everywhere. Eventually, the rabbi called everyone to order so that I could give my prayer. The guests put down their champagne glasses, and I read a prayer based on a prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. 'Make their lives together a sacrament of your love to this broken world, so that unity may overcome estrangement, forgiveness heal guilt, and joy triumph over despair.' Wow, I thought. St. Francis must have foreseen this wedding when he wrote this prayer. I continued, 'As you teach them to bind up their own wounds, teach them also to heal the hurt of others. Marriage is not an end in itself, but rather a place where we begin, a place where we receive renewal and encouragement.' I always look for something that somebody else said about marriage. When it comes to this particular scripture passage, it comes up about every 3 or 4 years. Most of you know I use the lectionary. The lectionary are the referred verses to be read on any given Sunday. And this one is a particularly harsh, in our society, particularly harsh verse, a set of verses from Jesus. And of course, anytime anybody talks about marriage, we're getting into some pretty muddy water, as we all know. I notice how still and serious you all look about this particular thing. Some of you have to because you're sitting next to your spouse. But I think about the marriage ceremony that Barnwell talked about, the parents' look of horror. And having conducted many marriages myself, many weddings myself, and heard most of the comments being made about these weddings, and having experienced some of this myself in my own family, I realized, there's a lot of horror in families when marriages take place. Some of it you don't even know about, and some of it you know about very well, especially if it's a family with very different parenting heritages. Family life is so complicated, isn't it? I often thought I ought to make a list. When one time I even started it, and then God spoke to me and said, "What do you think you're doing, you fool?" And so I threw the list away, but I used to make a list of all the issues I had encountered in family life, in congregations, and in counseling. And I was going to publish the list in a newsletter one time. Long list of all these problems. And what I was trying to get at was the fact that, when we judge other people because they're not acting the way we want to, every one of us is somewhere on that list. There are some things happening in our lives, in our families, that we don't share with others unless it's in a counseling relationship or something like that. It's a very complicated world. And the baggage that you and I carry, I told you one time, one of the Lutheran churches in Chicago, there was a big red barrel in the narthex, and people were invited to leave their baggage in the barrel when they came to church. Now, women didn't put their purses in here, men didn't put their briefcases in there, that isn't what I meant. But all the things about life that are weighing them down, the idea was symbolically, just drop it in that barrel and come and hear what God has to say to you on this particular day through the prayers and the hymns and the sermon and the music and the people around you. Boy, we've got a lot of baggage. Everyone here. And if you think you don't have a lot of baggage, you're not old enough to understand, quite honestly, or you're in some kind of a world that I have never been able to identify with. Because there's a lot of baggage out there. In the prayer, Barnwell said, marriage is not an end in itself, but rather a place where we begin, a place where we receive renewal and encouragement. In a perfect world. Yes. Best case scenario, right? But our world is not perfect. And we are far from perfect people, and somehow we have to integrate all this into our relationships. And then comes the startling news to us that approximately half of all marriages end in divorce. And second marriages have a worse chance than first marriages in many cases. And we see in today's gospel that divorce has always been an issue. A hard and tough answer comes to us from Jesus, especially to us moderns, because many of us in this room have experienced divorce and many remarriage. And so this gospel sounds kind of rugged to us. But it wasn't rugged to those who first heard him. It was radical. The way he spoke about marriage and divorce was very radical to them. This was the kind of talk which eventually got him killed, because in this discussion, Jesus proclaims equality between men and women. Well, we've gone way beyond that. In most cases, we've gone way beyond that in our society and in our times. But in Jesus' time, this was a radical thought.